FutureDad 18, COVID Part 2. Lockdowns were an attempted communist revolution. Quote, "There is nothing more demoralising than to live amongst willful slaves." Anon. The COVID-19 lockdowns of the period 2020 to 2022 were a pivotal moment for the world. Of all the evil events in history, none were as filled with such a rancid blend of half-witted cringe and deliberate malevolence as that period. Almost every country, apart from famously Sweden, put in place a variety of public restrictions. They range from the ridiculous to the obscenely anti-human. I had the misfortune to live through that period in one of the most stringent of those regimes. Looking back on it now, I and others have the responsibility to pass on the grim lessons of that time, in the vain hope that it will never be repeated. So the objective in this essay is to make it plain that the lockdown measures were a precursor to a global communist pharmocracy, and that the political elites of the time, see FutureDad 38, Why Did the Elite Lie About Everything, gleefully used the pandemic safetyism as a convenient battering ram to force that objective through. It arguably didn't start as a fully formed objective at first. In some elites' minds, yes, in others, no. But along the way, hubris and unchecked power made it so. To keep the spotlight on the abuse, I will focus on the lockdown rules themselves rather than the disease's lethality, or lack thereof, or speculating on its origins. For a related discussion on safetyism, see FutureDad 13, COVID Part 1, Safetyism. I also include here discussion of the restrictive measures put in place for the non-jabbed. The reason I consider them as a continuum of the same tyranny is simple. Freedom via compliance to medical experimentation does not constitute reinstatement of liberty in a sane society. I describe below 7 COVID restrictions, what they were and what it meant in practice. Alongside that, I state a parallel, albeit more bloodier, example from communist takeovers of the recent past, from Mao to Castro. The intent is not to say lockdown events were commensurate with communist mass executions, but to say that they had similar techniques and driving principles. The endpoint of communism is always a mountain of skulls, but some communist projects falter just in time. So 1. Limitation on group gatherings. 2. Compulsory wearing of face masks in public. 3. Coerced medical experimentations. 4. Banning the unjabbed from access to food, i.e. restaurants and supermarkets. Banning the unjabbed from gyms, then eventually from going outside. 6. Censorship. 7. Government-sanctioned snitching. 1. Limitation on group gatherings. A restriction on the number of people you could stand near in public. The only place I could share a drink with friends was outside a local shop. You could buy 2 bottles of beer, then stand outside, only in groups of 2. The COVID police patrolled the area to aggressively enforce this. Even minor discussion about where you stood or about their belligerence led to being hectored and threatened like it was wartime and you were their prisoners. Lockdown is, after all, originally a prison term. I witnessed several instances of well-behaved citizens being shouted at or intimidated by baton-wielding officials. It became easier to understand how the German people came under the boot heel of their Nazi leaders in the 1930s. The learning outcome of this is that the police are not there for your protection and are not on your side. They demonstrated quite clearly that they are there to carry out the orders of the state, no matter how egregious those orders, or they cannot pay their mortgage and they will not collect a pension. The events following the Southport child massacre by a Muslim immigrant and the subsequent 2-tier policing in the UK only underlines this. All the policemen and women with sufficient moral compass or ethical backbone to say no have already left. Following that, it means I cannot in good conscience support the police and they do not police me by my consent. Historical communist example. Curtailing freedom of association in China. In Mao's China, workers had no formal rights to freedom of association, and efforts to organise free trade unions during and after Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 were wiped out in the government crackdown. 2. Compulsory wearing of face masks in public. A reasonable assumption would be that public means a busy setting like a cinema or a shopping mall. Only at first. Where I was, it eventually meant everywhere outside the confines of your own home, with no exceptions. Although if the government could install CCTV in everyone's homes, including their bathroom, they definitely would. This may be a feature in the lockdown sequel if Tony Blair's identity cards, digital ID, and his collaborator Larry Ellison's tiny body cams have anything to do with it. In practice, the universal perma-mask wearing meant that you could be hiking up a steep hill in the remote countryside and you would still be instructed to keep your mask on as you gasp for breath, as I was by an undercover COVID cop. There is no room for rationality or common sense in a totalitarian state. This also meant that in gyms, the single greatest source of natural well-being and improved health in the modern age, you had to do cardio with a dangerously diminished ability to breathe. Recall that all of this was for your health and safety. Historical communist example, none found. This was a world first. Even communist regimes of the past didn't manage to compel the obedient to broadcast their compliance on their face. They actually had to ask for papers, please. 3. Coerced medical experimentation. From the summer of 2020, the volume of panicked masses pleading for freedom from the cycle of top-down imposition of lockdowns kept on rising. It was hard to think over that noise, and that was exactly the point. The elites read the clamour for help as, let's rush through the development of a new stick for these donkeys. Problem, reaction, solution. By then, Project Fear was in full swing. By the time the gene therapy wearing a vaccine mustache was developed a few months later, the wall-to-wall propagandizing had risen to a similar crescendo to coerce and gaslight everyone into taking the jab. No, make that 2, and a booster, and another. In fact, let's make it a subscription service. Aside from being a giant public obedience test, which I gladly failed before it even began, it was replete with more lies and red flags than a CCP-led military parade. See FutureDad 35, COVID Part 3, The Lies of Lockdown, LOL. Intelligent, non-compliant, law-abiding, tax-paying citizens lost their jobs, their businesses, and their freedoms in every avenue of life for daring to object to this, and in doing so were faced with a smug, complicit shrug of the shoulders from their manager or HR or customer service representatives or babbling millionaire newsreaders pleading for the unjabbed to be jailed. This gigantic crime will never be forgotten. What is the ultimate recourse of the non-compliant? One happily ignored by governments and corporations across the erstwhile free world? Well, in England and Wales, mandatory vaccines are illegal via the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984. Beyond that, its worldwide counterpart is in UNESCO's Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, UDBHR, which achieved unanimous acceptance in 2005 by 191 member nations. It is the only bioethical text to which the entire world has committed itself. The principle described in Article 6 has 2 important components, providing information and giving consent. Both of these must be applied during any medical intervention. For the former, the information provided by 9 pages of Pfizer's mRNA side effects, together with the initial misuse of the science, informed my decision to refuse the jab. For the latter UDBHR component, consent, I simply chose not to consent. Any coercion, veiled or direct, upon this decision breaches the UDBHR Article 6, which the world signed. Others around me were not so lucky, and were browbeaten and bullied until they did. No one who refused the experimental gene therapy regrets it now. Historical communist example. Medical experimentation in Eastern Europe. Communist Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia conducted state-approved medical interventions on its citizens in the 1960s and 70s. It involved using LSD injections on the uninformed populace to explore weaponizing the drug's disorienting effects against the West during the Cold War. 4. Banning the unjabbed from access to food, i.e. restaurants and supermarkets. I was barred from both restaurants and supermarkets for a 3-month period. I resorted to stockpiling food like it was the apocalypse. When that ran out, I was forced to sneak into a supermarket to buy food. I will never forget the indignity of being forced into breaking the law to prevent starvation. This, together with being banned from my gym, motivated me to leave the country as soon as I could. I emigrated 8 months later at considerable cost and also disruption to my career. However, nothing is costlier than losing one's freedom. Historical communist example, control the food supply. Joseph Stalin's Great Purge in communist Russia began as show trials against the kulaks, which were small farm owners, in an attempt at collectivization of the food supply, called the 5-year plan. Between 5 and 9 million people died in the resulting famine, including 4 million in the Holodomor, as a result of the seizing of agricultural land in Ukraine. 5. Banning the unjabbed from gyms, then eventually from going outside. In my gym and others, the unjabbed were barred from entry and their memberships revoked. This pressure, of course, came from the government, who enforced it via the gym owners. Outwardly, at least, the gyms folded like a cheap suit. This wasn't even the worst part. The matter-of-factness with which the customer care advisor informed me of my banning was surreal and eye-opening. With a breezy public service tone, she told me my membership was revoked due to me not taking the jab. It was the same tone she'd use if they recovered the trainers I had reported missing, and I could pick them up at my earliest convenience. She was one cog in the machine, aimed at hemming unjabbed people in so they felt they had no place to go but stay indoors. The next step was keeping you indoors and eventually in camps. Making the unjabbed actually not leave their apartments was in place in mainland China and Australia already by 2021, and some were being shipped off to camps by 2022. As the resistance and outcries increased and the lethality rate of COVID dropped to half as dangerous as having a bath, bigger and more efficient, i.e. more prison-like, camps were being built. It didn't take an extraordinary leap of imagination to see where this was going. Historical communist example, curtailing freedom of movement in North Korea. Under the ideology of the Workers' Party of Korea, which reaffirmed its commitment to communism in 2021, it restricted any citizens from leaving the country under pain of death. Additionally, Stalin's 1930s Russia labour camps were initially built for kulaks and expanded to any political prisoner when it became efficient to help them die there, kneeling in front of snow-filled ditches they dug themselves. 6. Censorship. Whether by shadow banning, anti-lockdown or anti-vaccine comments, or deleting online comments or accounts outright, the government's version of the truth was forcibly implemented by its tech platform proxies and mouthpieces in the mainstream media. Doctors who didn't toe the line were silenced and discredited. The Great Barrington Declaration of hundreds of concerned epidemiologists and other scientists was ignored. The entire media apparatus moved in lockstep. Even Dr. Robert Malone, the co-designer of the mRNA technology behind the vaccine, was censored from speaking out against its misuse and his vaccine hesitancy. Politicians, even from different parties, fawned over one another as to how hard to lock down. None who opposed the party line were given airtime. In the UK, the pseudo-opposition left cheek of the Uniparty, Labour, willed on an even harder lockdown. The media lapdogs, whose biggest sponsors were pharma giants, were in lockstep. Rather than challenge the tyranny, they cheered on the fat NHS nurses dancing on TikTok in their empty hospital corridors. This mass-chilling effect of any opposing voice, whether by force or by media-led convention, echoed tyrannies throughout history. Suppression on one side is usually accompanied by outsized promotion on the other, depending on the political elite's goals. The instruction was clear: shut up, cover your mouth with fabric, cheer for your leaders and betters, follow the markings on the floor, and pull up your sleeve when we tell you. Historical communist version. Curtailing freedom of expression in Cambodia. Nothing was allowed to be published under Pol Pot's reign. The Communist Party of Kampuchea executed artists and singers and filmmakers in the communist takeover of Cambodia in the 1970s. 7. Government-sanctioned snitching. Government encouragement of informers is a mainstay of all totalitarian states in decline. The bigger the network of snitchers, the closer to gravitational collapse it becomes. This was a prominent feature of the UK, where curtain twitchers were encouraged to snitch on any neighbours who flouted lockdown rules. Snitching government then and now has the same emotional energy of a bitter ex-girlfriend confiding with your friends out of earnest concern for you. The snitchers wear two masks at minimum: a face mask and a mask of concern, hiding the self-righteous malice. Historical communist example: encouraging government informants in Eastern Germany. By 1989, the Stasi, the security state police, had around 200,000 carefully categorized informants, encouraged by material and social incentives, sometimes cash, sometimes just blackmail. This led to the perpetual gamesmanship of informing on your neighbours first before they did. The best informants were ones in constant contact with the public: teachers, tram drivers, nurses. In conclusion, all but one COVID-related measure had parallels of previous communist, revolutionary dictatorships. This is not a coincidence. The lockdown was merely an attempted, opportunistic forerunner to something much greater, a teaser trailer for the main movie. The scale was intended to be synchronized worldwide, far beyond nation states. Globalist tentacles slithered around the world, tightening their grip. This meant not only super governments, big pharma and legacy media, but also supranational financial institutions like the IMF. The Belarusian President Lukashenko said in September 2020 that he refused the IMF's offer of $940 million to install a draconian lockdown. Globalists threw everything at this project, including to less than cooperative nations, to make global communism 2.0. We are all very lucky that the narrative fell apart and free men and women stood against it. Now that the severity of the lasting societal damage and personal human misery are becoming clear, all that's left is a reckoning. Lockdowns and COVID jab malfeasance isn't over until those responsible and their cheerleaders are in jail, or preferably under one. I will continue to catalogue the deception and gaslighting of this attempted global communist revolution in FutureDad 35 COVID-3, The Lies of Lockdown, LOL. If you don't learn from these 3 COVID essays in particular, and build a wall of sovereignty around you and your family, it will be much, much worse next time. FutureDad.